Welcome to Group Talk. 4 shows, 1 podcast from the Small Group Network focusing on topics relevant to small group ministries. Whether you're in a church of 100 or 10,000, whether you're a volunteer or staff, we want to support, encourage, and equip you to lead well. So relax, listen, and enjoy Here to There with Carolyn Taketa.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Here to There, where we learn how to move from here, where we are now, to there, to where God is calling us. On today's program, we discuss the critical issues related to mental health and the church. More specifically, how we as small group leaders, who are not mental health experts, and our typical small groups, which are not designed as support groups for mental health issues, can still support and come alongside people in our groups who struggle with these issues. Just a note to keep in mind, I taped this interview with Dr. David Wang back in February before COVID, so you won't hear any references to the pandemic or to its effects on our churches and our communities. The questions that Dr. Wang addresses and the insights he offers on these mental health issues are even more relevant and valuable today in the context of the current pandemic and the huge emotional toll that it has taken on everyone, but especially on those who are already struggling with mental health issues. And in recent months, we've seen reports of dramatic increases in the percentage of new people who are struggling with mental distress, such as anxiety, depression, isolation, loneliness, grief. So many things. It's a lot that we're all dealing with. And that means that our churches and our small groups are also dealing with it. So we need to become better equipped to love and care for those affected by mental illness. And part of that is assessing when people need more help than our groups can offer, and then how to navigate through those waters together. So I hope this conversation is encouraging to you and is helpful for you and your ministry. So a couple of years ago, I heard Dr. David Wang speak at a conference on mental health, and it was the first conference of that type I had been to in the church. And so I was very impressed by his breadth of knowledge on the topic, but even more by his pastoral heart. And as he fielded really hard questions, he responded with so much truth and grace and just really helpful, practical tips. And so these topics don't have clean, easy answers, and they're really messy for us to navigate through. And he was so honest about the challenges of it that I just really wanted to have him on the program. So I have to confess, I've been pursuing and very persistent for a while now. And I don't think I've ever chased someone down so hard. So I'm so glad you said yes. Thank you for saying yes. And so I've been waiting a while to have this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here. And this topic is something that's so near and dear to my heart. I wear a lot of different hats in any given week. I'm a professor at Biola University. We have a school of clinical psychology called Rosemead School of Psychology, and I'm a professor there. So I train future Christian psychologists. I oversee a bunch of research on spiritual development and spiritual formation and trauma. And I'm also a part-time pastor of spiritual formation at a local congregation in Fullerton, California. And about 15 years ago, I started off as a college pastor at the church that I grew up in San Jose, California. Cool. And that's actually how I got my vision into pursuing mental health as well.
Oh, that's so great. Well, you gave the bio, so I don't have to, which is great. He's being really modest. He actually has a very long resume. And one of the reasons I wanted to have the conversation with you is because you understand both areas, both psychological mental health field, but also the church world. And as a spiritual formation pastor, you get what people are wrestling with, and you know what small groups, I'm sure you have small groups at your church, and they're probably dealing with these issues as well.
That's right.
So let's start off with kind of the landscape of mental health and mental illness, and what, why it affects every church pretty much.
Yeah. Well, mental health and mental illness, they're both conditions that are very common and prevalent in society. And in a similar way, they're just as prevalent within church communities as well. There's some recent statistics coming out of the American Psychiatric Association that suggests that nearly 1 in 5 individuals or adults in the U.S., they experience some form of mental illness, and 1 in 24, about 4%, has serious mental illness. And these are prevalence rates over the span of just 1 year. So if you kind of consider the number of people who might have encountered personally mental illness at some point in their lifetime, the prevalence is even significantly greater. And when we think of our church communities, which are, representative of the neighborhoods and the communities that we all live in, they're just as prevalent.
But then why, historically, there has been such a stigma and a reluctance in the church to address these issues? Because they are so prevalent, they're only becoming more prevalent.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's a complicated situation. I think there's many kind of theological, kind of personal biases that many Christians and many Christian communities, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, might kind of endorse that make it difficult for those of us who are Christian who do struggle with mental illness to actually come forth and share our experiences.
And let's just go right there. Let's just talk about what some of those perceptions, assumptions, myths, spiritual doctrine, maybe for some churches. What are some of those things? Like, let's say, like the top ones you hear often related to mental illness in the church, and why we're so reluctant.
Yeah, well, I really like what Ed Stetzer has to say on the topic. He's the head of the Billy Graham Center over at Wheaton College, and they host annual conferences on various issues facing pastors and churches. And in fact, I just spoke in one of his conferences a couple months ago on pastoral burnout, which is an important mental health issue as well. That many pastors face. And I think the year before, he addressed the topic of mental illness in church communities. And some of the ideas that he brought up are ideas that I have seen quite commonly within Christian communities. So one example of this might be this idea that mental illness might be a sign of personal weakness. This idea that, we might be feeling anxious or feeling depressed because we just haven't sucked it up and powered through, or even worse, there could be this kind of assumption that maybe it's some sort of character flaw. Maybe it's because I'm not, lacking discipline, or I'm not, using my willpower to the full extent. I'm not like taking every thought captive.
Well, especially when you layer on the spiritual side, I think, and what I've heard growing up in churches where mental health was never discussed, the idea was that if you just prayed more, if you just read the Bible more, then this would just not be an issue. Rejoice always. Like, why can't you just rejoice always? And that just puts an additional burden on people that are struggling.
That's right. And I think that is a direction that we might take when when many of our church communities understand mental illness, that it may not only be a sign that, of a weakness in our character, but as you said, that there might be a sign of weakness in our faith, that maybe we're depressed and anxious because we're not trusting Jesus enough. Maybe we're not praying hard enough or something like that. And interestingly, I mean, how I originally became a psychologist, it actually came out of my experiences as a college pastor, and I loved working with college students, with young people, and I find that with our youth, oftentimes if you provide them with a pastor or of some sort of adult figure that's present in their lives and that truly cares for them, you'd be so surprised how much of their personal junk they're open to sharing with you.
Right.
And as I was a college pastor, I would have a lot of my kids over at my place. We play video games, make sandwiches, talk about, girl and guy drama and all that. And then over the course of just sharing life together, they would share about all these emotional hurts that come from their families, hurt from divorce. And I remember having this really God just blessed us with such a thriving kind of prayer, emotional healing ministry in our church and in that youth group and college group. And I remember thinking to myself that, we've gone so far, and God has kind of gave us wonderful breakthroughs. And yet at the same time, I knew that I still wanted to go further, but I didn't know how to get there. And I felt frustrated with my lack of training. I didn't know what the process looked like. I didn't know how to accompany someone through the whole process of emotional healing. And that's when the idea popped in my mind to pursue further study, to kind of observe and learn how we can actually, like the mechanics of actually helping someone heal emotionally.
Yeah. So do you think, though, that sometimes there's an overlap between the emotional issues or the mental health issues and then also some spiritual issues? It feels like sometimes could they like feed into each other?
Absolutely. I feel like when we look at mental health, especially, but I think this would apply to so much of other facets of life. I prefer to look at things from a bio, psycho, social, spiritual kind of lens.
This is why you're a professor. That's a lot of hyphens.
That's right. And the idea behind it is that, the biology, the psychology, the social life, the spiritual life, they're all created by God. And they all overlap, and God is the Lord of all of them, and it's, conceptually, it might be helpful to think of them in isolation, but when we're actually living real life, they're all integrated in some form or fashion.
That's a really good point. It's much more holistic than our therapeutic culture. So it seems like we kind of go in one of two directions.
Right.
We in the church. So we either go, okay, these are mental health issues. So then we sideline them off to our, care ministries, if you're fortunate enough in your church to have one, or to our volunteer counselors or therapists, or we kind of sideline the psychological issues there. And then we go, okay, we'll help you with the spiritual issues. But because they are more holistic, it's just even harder for churches to know how to help people that show up with these symptoms. And so what are some things that, that churches can do kind of more globally before we dial down to small groups that would help support people and families that are struggling with this?
Right. So there is a ton of research literature that speaks to kind of the crucial contributions of social support. As it applies to recovery from mental illness. So I happen to do a lot of clinical work and research in the area of trauma and PTSD, like post-traumatic stress disorder. And within the trauma literature, there's actually empirical research that has found that a lack of social support, it actually predicted more strongly PTSD symptoms than other factors, including the severity of the trauma event itself.
Wow, that's really great news. It means that we can actually help people.
Right. So, this is kind of a mind-blowing kind of finding that even over and above how severe the trauma was originally, like social support actually predicts more powerfully the degree to which someone can recover. And it's also a very kind of hollowing and very kind of humbling point as well, because it goes both ways. If we do social support well, it can be a tremendous resource and source of strength and support for people to recover. And on the flip side, if we don't do it well and we actually if we kind of live out what we call negative social support, it actually can cause great damage among those of us who are suffering.
So what would be some examples of positive social support versus negative social support from your research?
Yeah. So positive social support, broadly defined, it's the kind of social support that makes us feel loved and supported and that we're not alone. And negative social support, broadly defined, is that social support that gives kind of an opposite reaction. It makes us feel judged. It makes us feel alone. So sometimes when we feel blamed for what's going on, if other people doubt what we have to say, or if we feel criticized by other people, if people were to say, hey, just stop feeling that way.
When they try to fix it, right, instead of empathizing. Okay.
Right. And that could be a form of negative social support.
So it seems like even if you weren't dealing with mental health stuff, both the positive social support would be beneficial for anyone. That's kind of part of biblical community, is to support and encourage and to walk alongside one another in times of trouble as well as times of joy. So I guess, is it just heightened at a higher level when you're dealing with someone with trauma or mental health issues?
Absolutely. I think the principle would be the same for all humans, but I think they're especially kind of pronounced when it comes to people who are in acute mental conditions.
So when you talk about that, Dave, does it make a difference whether they're in a trauma support group? For example, we have a support group for women who've experienced betrayal. We have an addiction support group, but we have these versus a typical small group, which most of us on probably most of our listeners run, which is regular people. We are not specially trained to help with any particular trauma. We will have people that have experienced trauma in the group because it's a cross section of the population in our churches and in our communities. But we're not isolating it as a support group for a particular thing. We're actually just integrating to the whole. Does it make a difference in terms of being helpful to the person dealing with the issue if they're in one type of a support group versus a regular, let's just call them regular community small group?
Yes. For one, I am a huge fan of those kind of condition-specific support groups within churches. Like Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, has very strong Christian, roots.
For sure. And
when I worked in substance abuse in the past, like research and clinical work, a lot of secular psychologists have kind of a bias against AA because of the spiritual kind of elements integrated into the process, and the funny thing is that so many people have tried to develop alternative kind of treatments for substance abuse, like without kind of the spiritual component. And we, after decades of this kind of work and research, we still haven't found anything better. It's granted AA is not perfect. There's limitations to it, but as far as we can tell, it still remains one of the gold standard treatments for substance abuse. And it's a wonderful model of like mutual accompaniment, that I feel like the rest of the church can learn greatly from.
Oh, for sure, especially around accountability, around humility. I mean, it's built on biblical principles, which may be why it still has lasted and is so effective.
And I love this idea within AA, this notion that I'm always going to be struggling with this the rest of my life, and that just clears the way for me to just accompany you through the ups and downs, and to come in with the mentality that I'm here with you for the long term. And this is something that we need to be humble about. This is something that we need to attend to over and over again. And it's not something that I'm just going to be surprised, like, oh my goodness, this happened again. How could you, and turn into kind of like I can fix this and that's it. And I think again, the rest of the Christian community, we have so much to learn from that, because I feel like so much of our spirituality is premised upon quick fixes, and we aren't equipped to kind of accompany someone over the long term.
I think we've gotten better at that, but I absolutely agree. I think we've gotten better because we've now understood the value of relationships more, and the loneliness epidemic and all the disconnectedness. I think we're better at empathy because now it's in the popular media. I mean, all of those trends help us. But say you had, someone in your church who was a recovering alcoholic, and the choice for them was, to go to AA or to go to a regular small group. What would you say? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I feel like if, there's a lot of factors to consider, but one of the first things I would look at is the degree of their sobriety at the moment, and the amount of support that they have, specifically to their struggles with substances. If their struggles are quite pronounced or acute, then I think something like AA or Celebrate Recovery, I hear great things about them as well. They might be a great entry point into a church community. Might be a great place to start.
So it's a great place to start. So I want to, this is a question that comes up a lot among small group pastors is, how do you know if someone is in a place where they are healthy enough or have managed their mental illness enough? Maybe they are now taking medication more regularly and it's evened out, or I don't know what language to use. So forgive me if I use the wrong language.
No.
This is in my field. But how do you know if they're, for lack of a better term, healthy enough or functional enough to be in a regular small group where people aren't necessarily trained, versus someone who may be more acute, as you said, or maybe need more of that support? Like, how do you decide if someone is functional enough and it will be helpful to them and helpful to the group? Like, that's $1 million question for small group pastors.
Yeah, and I'll take a stab at this. I think there's, we can have 3 or 4 podcasts on this one question. But let me start with the foundational belief that absolutely people with mental health issues can be and should be part of a regular small group. And this comes from just the biblical vision of family. They're created in the image of God just as we are. We're all in the family of God. And just as a healthy family doesn't exclude or kind of isolate those members of us who are struggling, there are unique cases that we have to adjust to as well. But the goal and the heart is always for us to be together and for us to thrive together and support each other. So that's kind of like the overall vision of where I come from. With that being said, it needs to be discerned, obviously, from like a case-by-case basis. And there's a lot of factors for us to look into, including, things like the severity of one's mental illness, the nature of one's mental illness. And I also think we need to consider the composition of the rest of the small group as well. So it's kind of a question of, well, is it good for the small group, for the person struggling with mental illness? But I think just as important is the question, is the small group good for that person who's struggling with mental illness?
That's a really good point, because we do focus on the person entering the group. And this is where the leader ends up in a quandary, because they have to care for all 12 people in their group. And one person, especially someone with mental illness, may end up taking a disproportionate amount of energy and time.
Right.
And then what about the other members? That ends up being kind of sticky unless the other members are also on board with the family concept, which I love. I haven't heard it phrased quite that way, and I think that really sets the foundation well, because that's biblical. But I think for the leader, it's really hard, because how much time and space do you give to one person? Right. In a family, to your point, David, in a family system, if I have a family and I have a kid with special needs, that kid can't help but take a lot more time and energy than a typical kid. That's just how reality is. And so I feel like, is that okay for a small group to kind of be like, hey, this guy's part of our family and this is what's going to require? Or do you kind of think about the perspective of the members? Like, I didn't sign up for this. I want a happy, easy group, or whatever it is they're looking for.
Right. Yes. All of the above. I feel like this notion of consent is important, because there are conditions where, like you said, it is going to be a high investment that's going to be long term. And sometimes people come to these life groups with many important needs themselves that might be overlooked. And there are certainly cases where it would be appropriate for a small group to not incorporate someone with these special needs. And I think if that's the case, then we want to make sure that there's systems in place within the larger church context to ensure that those individuals have those support networks and ministries and adequate coverage as well. So it's definitely kind of a case-by-case basis and group-by-group basis kind of a thing.
And which is why it's so messy. But are there certain types of mental health issues that you see more often in church that's really manageable for people in groups? Like I'm thinking of it seems like everybody, or at least every millennial I hear, sort of struggles with anxiety, apparently. This has become like a hot thing. My daughter told me that if you don't struggle with anxiety, you're weird on a college campus. So that seems to be like a catch-all, or depression. And there seems to be certain ones that kind of are not so disruptive to a group that social support could really help with, versus something that's a much more clinical case, like borderline disorder, or something that's really you would need some expertise in. So are there types of issues that you would be more inclined to say, hey, let's try this out in a group on a case by case?
Yeah, great question. I think, and there's a lot of variability even within the conditions. So not all people who struggle with depression are the same, and not all people who struggle with anxiety are the same. So even within each of these diagnostic kind of categories, there's quite a lot of variation. So some of the considerations and factors that I look into as I'm making kind of an implicit judgment about maybe let's go forward and incorporate this individual. One of the first things that I look for is the amount of insight that they have over their condition, the amount of insight they have over over themselves. And
so their self-awareness then of the person with the mental illness?
Exactly.
Okay.
So if they're familiar with the fact that they're depressed, or familiar with the fact they're anxious and they're open to talking about it. If it pops up, it's not this pink elephant in the room that no one's allowed to talk about. And if they're it's not that we're expecting perfection, because none of us are perfect, even especially those with mental illness. But if they're the type of individual that, they might act out temporarily, but then they're able to kind of contain themselves, and then afterwards go, oh, this is what happened. And to take those steps to repair and to kind of learn from those experiences, then that's a really positive sign that would suggest that they would be a wonderful small group member. And this idea of self-awareness and self-knowledge, a lot of these concepts are true not just for those of us who struggle with mental illness. They're true for everyone in our churches and everyone in our small groups. There's John Calvin, in the beginning of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, he talks about what theologians call the double knowledge, how the knowledge of God and the knowledge of self, how they go hand in hand. And how, as we know more and more God and His holiness, we kind of naturally become more and more aware of our own nature in the process. So I feel like this kind of idea of insight and self-knowledge, not only helpful when it comes to mental illness, but is crucial even when it comes to spiritual formation as well.
That's true. That's really great. I just think of all these cases and groups where someone may be struggling with something and they'll say, hey, I'm bipolar and I'm on meds, and every so often you'll see this kind of behavior from me. And the group is like totally fine with that. And they learn from it and they get blessed by it, versus someone who's unaware and they blow up the group. And we've had those cases too.
Yes, that's right.
They're unaware, or they can't see themselves, and the leader can't call them out on it. It feels like a minefield, and then next thing you know, there's nobody left in the group because the leader hasn't addressed it. It's like, that's not good for the group member either, right?
Right.
To allow them to run amok like that doesn't help them. But how do leaders put boundaries in place for that? Again, knowing that they're not mental health professionals.
Yeah, and even for mental health professionals, a lot of times we might be able to forecast something like that a little bit earlier than typical individuals, but we also oftentimes can't tell what we have in front of us until we see the effects. So
that's so disappointing. I just feel like if I could stick a therapist in every small group, that we would be home free.
Hopefully that should be helpful, but But I don't think it's going to be a perfect kind of guarantee that these things won't ever pop up. A lot of times we don't know what we have on our hands until after some of the damage is already done, where an entire small group just feels exhausted and depleted. That's when we start realizing, like, oh, maybe are there some questions we need to ask and discuss because there's something wrong here.
Which is almost too late. But then how do you have that conversation? Do you have the conversation with the member first? Let's just put a scenario, and this is a common enough one, where there's a member who has something. We don't know what it is. We can't diagnose it, but they're being really difficult. Maybe they just are going through a hard thing. They're more needy than usual. Maybe they have a mental illness. Maybe they're off meds. Who knows? But there's an issue. The leader then hesitates because do they have that one-on-one conversation with that person? And then sometimes I have actually advised, and if I've done this wrong, now I have to go back and fix it. But I've actually advised the leader at times in a group that's been together a while, where there's a high level of trust, to have a conversation with the group members apart from the person, and to say, hey, this is what's going on with Joe, and let's be here for him. This is what it would look like if this is too hard for you. I understand, but kind of let him in on it rather than just feel like this is the leader's problem to manage. And it has worked at times where you have a mature enough group, they'll sign on and buy in together. But the leader typically pushes back because they're like, oh, that feels so disloyal, and like I'm gossiping, and gossip is sin. And I'm like, I don't think it's gossiping. How do you feel about like that sort of advice or that scenario?
Yeah, I think that's sound. And as you said, I mean, when it comes to working with humans, it's, there is no perfect kind of solution or equation that we can follow to, guarantee the perfect results every single time. But I really like the principle of openness and of transparency. And I find that, one of the greatest ways that a scenario like this can be destructive in a small group is when no one talks about it and everyone feels like they're the only ones who are carrying this burden. Like maybe everyone else is a good Christian and they just don't mind, and they say the perfect things, but I'm the only one who feels frustrated and feels depleted. And a lot of times when the leaders of a small group have the courage to kind of start off with maybe a confession, like, hey, this is just how I'm feeling. I'm struggling with this. I don't know if this is the right way to feel, but this is just how I feel. And for other small group members who are trustworthy, oftentimes you'll find a response that is validating and normalizing, and other people will feel like, I'm so glad you mentioned that because I feel the same way. And then the next step that these people can, that those of us who feel this way can take would be, well, what can we do in terms of next steps to help this individual?
Right.
And before we get there, I think this is something that a lot of people in general, including Christians, struggle with, is that we need to respect our limitations.
Yes.
We cannot save everyone just by our own strength and our own resources. And that's true for mental health professionals just as much as it's true for any non-mental health professional.
And I want to underscore that. I want our listener to hear that, because I know that our group leaders, and especially our small group point leaders, are so eager to help. And they sometimes don't know their limitations. And it's really okay to say, I can't handle this. This is too much for me. And I have to always tell our leaders over and over, it's okay if this is beyond your capacity and beyond your group's capacity. It's okay. And we have, we can bring other resources to bear on the issue, and to not let them be afraid of saying that somehow they failed, because they'll be kind of embarrassed about it. Sometimes they feel like they failed because they can't help or fix or keep the group together in the face of somebody who's blowing it up because they just can't manage it. So I love that kind word to say part of the boundary, part of being a good leader is knowing what you can't do, not just knowing what you can do.
Yeah, and it requires this a certain kind of humility and maturity to be able to accept that reality.
Yeah, I think the hard part is I just feel like it's not being like a good Christian to ask someone to leave and let's go there. That's a hard conversation to say to someone, and usually that conversation gets kicked up to the point leader level where they're like, can you help me tell this person who's not healthy enough to be in a group right now? And that's kind of language we use for better or for worse right now. And then we try to bring some resources along with it. Or we ask them to go to maybe like in the earlier scenario with someone recovering from alcohol abuse that, maybe right now you're a season where you're more tempted and your disease is kind of becoming more progressed. So perhaps you do both. You come here, but you also keep your other community that will help you because they understand your struggle that our group can't because we don't have that struggle. So I think, but that conversation is always hard because, and we've had it blow up sometimes where they feel really hurt. They feel like, rejected by the church because now, small group is standing in for the church, right? Yeah. And then they're standing in maybe for God. I mean, heaven forbid, but like that, those layers get placed on, and it just feels really risky. So how would you advise us to have that conversation where the person is too disruptive and too difficult and not self-aware enough to be in a regular group?
Yeah, and that I think is such a helpful and common kind of situation that happens in churches. And kind of going back to that biopsychosocial spiritual model I was talking about earlier, I think a lot of times how this shows up within church context is that people come to church with a history and some baggage of hurt from families, hurt from close friends, where they felt betrayed, when they've had relationships with certain authority figures that betrayed their trust and kind of manipulated them or kind of took advantage of them. And then when they come to church, it's sometimes really hard to not to contain that kind of distrust in your church relationships. So a lot of times they come into church with kind of, it's almost as if they're expecting the church leaders to replay the same kind of, abusive dynamics that they've experienced earlier in life. Or, when something that looks like they're being rejected happens at church, it just kind of attaches to some past rejections and past abuses, and it kind of all becomes, this jumbled, mess. It's all kind of the same in their mind. And a lot of times it is exactly how you describe it. It's a minefield. We don't know exactly what's in a person's history and in a person's mind. So it's quite possible for us to, if such a thing existed, for us to say the perfect words and still for it to be interpreted in the worst possible way, and for the outcome to go to the worst possible case. And it can still go there even if we handle a situation kind of quote unquote perfectly,
That's actually kind of freeing to know that. To know that we can pray like crazy, we can do our very, very best, but have it still not be received well. I mean, we can only control what communication we're delivering. We can't control the receiving. I mean, that's a God thing.
Right. And I feel like so many of us in ministry, we're carrying the burden of so many things that are just outside of our control.
Why do we do that? What is wrong with us?
That's a whole nother conversation.
That'll be part 2 next year. I'll have to put myself on your calendar next year and go, why are we so dumb? Why do we keep carrying the stuff that God's not giving us to carry? Because we want to make things better. So so if you were training small group leaders on, how to be inclusive, how not to be afraid of different mental health issues that are going to walk in, because this is just what's in our communities, how to not be afraid of that, at the same time, how to manage it to the best of our ability. Like, what would you say in a training in a nutshell?
Well, there's a couple things. I mean, I think, of course, what we're doing right now is super helpful, where we want to raise awareness and talk more about mental illness. We want to learn more about it, like each of us doing our own research, so that at the very least, we can kind of recognize some common forms of mental illness when it's there.
Yes.
And so that we know when to seek out additional help in those cases where help is definitely needed and help is prudent. From a theological perspective, I think that what would be really helpful for many of our churches is to reclaim the other half of Scripture that we don't preach on. You know, the not so happy part of Scripture.
So the non-prosperity gospel side.
Yes, you know, and I mean, I don't know if people realize this, but someone's actually done research on the Psalms of the Bible, and these are kind of the original songs and worship songs of that are codified into Scripture. And I think this researcher by the name of Glenn Pemberton, he found that over 50% of the Psalms in the Bible are actually Psalms of lament.
Yes, this is true.
And when you look at the top, 5 or top 10 most, top 100 most commonly sung worship songs in church, he contrasted that with with the observation that less than 5% of the praise songs, the modern praise songs that we most commonly sing, can qualify as psalms of lament.
Interesting.
That they tend to be kind of songs of celebration and songs of victory, which certainly have their place within the Christian narrative. But we've really missed out and lost out on the rightful place of negative emotions in the Christian life. I grew up in Northern California, and one of the Christian radio stations that I grew up listening to was K-Love.
We have that in LA too.
Yeah, and I love K-Love. Grew up with it, wonderful ministry, and they have, I think they're at least one of the old motto for K-Love is, positive, encouraging K-Love.
Yes, they still say this. This has been around a long time, I guess.
Yeah, and I like that idea. And as a pastor and as a psychologist, I would love for them to kind of add a few more words after that too. Because sometimes it's tempting to feel like, well, to be positive and to be encouraging means that it's Christian, or to be Christian means to be positive and encouraging all the time. And that's actually not biblical. So to be sad, to be in grief, to be angry, to be experiencing these negative emotions, they're just as Christian as the positive ones, and they're just in parts of the Bible that we don't preach about very much, like books like Lamentations and Jeremiah and Hosea. And when you even look at the life of Christ, and you look at if you did a study of all the range of emotions and thoughts and feelings that Jesus had, you would see a very balanced kind of set of emotions between positive and negative. Jesus isn't positive, encouraging all the time.
Well, the Sermon on the Mount certainly is not, and the Beatitudes certainly is not.
Right.
But you're right. I think that, and it's interesting because my senior pastor and I, we had a conversation a while back, and we're talking about which sermons have him in the lobby the longest, where people line up and they want to be prayed for and talk about. And they're usually the sermons where he's addressing places of pain. And that's where people live. And that's where it is in small groups too. But somehow, even in group life, we have this misperception that it's easier to rejoice with people who are rejoicing than it is to grieve with those who are grieving. Yes. And people come with baggage, but we seem to prefer the baggage that is kind of more tidy baggage, if I can say, or we've come through it, so now we have a happy ending with a bow, and so now we can talk about it, versus just the crazy mess in between, or someone who's just been gone through just a really hard life and had a lot of stuff happen. And it makes things messy. And I think the more we embrace the mess, I'm right there with you. I actually really like the Psalms of Lament. I actually like Ecclesiastes and Job. So that makes me a little bit strange. I find it comforting to know that God's the same forever and that he gets that life is hard. But I think that probably puts me a little bit of a minority. So I think when these issues come up in groups, where I struggle as a group's pastor is I want to equip our leaders to know their boundaries, but also to err on the side of inclusion. I think that's the awareness part. That's been more of a cultural shift for our churches, and how can we help with that? Like, I love how you set the basis. This is a family model. You don't kick people out of your family because they're difficult. Maybe some people do, but biblically we wouldn't. But how do you set that as a base? Because I know some of the churches and our listeners that's not the base. And so what are like baby steps to kind of start having a more inclusive model, not just around other issues of diversity, but around issues around mental illness, which are just more scary for us because we just don't know as much about it.
Yes, good question. And again, I think I'll start my answer by addressing some theological kind of considerations here. And I think the first theological consideration is that a lot of times, and as you were talking about how a lot of times, like Christians, us Christians will tend to prefer those kind of forms of suffering that kind of they're kind of more tidy. We can kind of wrap it up in a bow.
They're socially acceptable.
Yes. And I think alongside that line of thinking, we tend to read in and fit in people's experiences, especially when they're suffering from mental illness or trauma or whatnot. We try to fit it in artificially into kind of the redemption narrative of Christ. This idea of, Good Friday is when Jesus died on the cross, and it was horrible and tragic, and there was tremendous suffering. But you know what? It was all worthwhile because just 3 days later, exactly. Easter Sunday is just around the corner, and he resurrected from the dead, and he conquered death, and we have victory with him, and that's. I absolutely affirm that. That is at the core of our faith.
Sure.
And at the same time, theologically, we have to recognize that Christ's victory over death, it's not fully consummated yet. Right? It's done because he's resurrected from the dead, but it's not fully consummated because Christ hasn't returned yet. Right. And until he is returned, all of us, his family, his body, we're in this in-between stage where we see God is active enough for us to know that he's there, and he gives us breakthroughs. And even those breakthroughs, however miraculous they might be, they're rarely, if ever, complete breakthroughs. Right. Because that complete breakthrough doesn't come until Christ returns.
Right, so that's the now and the not yet. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So kind of creating spiritual Christian language for that already, but not yet, so that there's space for victory and celebration, but there's also space for a kind of grief that is ongoing on this side of heaven. So, for example, as a pastor, I'm part of the teaching rotation of my church, and last year I taught a 4-week series on lament. And is
this online somewhere?
Oh yeah, it's on our website.
Okay, so we'll link it. We'll have to go back and look for the lament one. It'll be very popular.
Sounds good. OneLifeCityChurch.org. We're in Fullerton, California, and what I did was, I taught on lament. Did expository preaching from different passages of scripture, but I also integrated a practical element. So what I did was, after the teaching component of my message, I would invite different members of our congregation to kind of participate in sort of an interview, kind of like the interview we're having here. And I would interview people in our congregation that are experiencing some sort of pain and suffering of the sort that is not easily fixable. There's no short-term solution. So stuff like, parents passing away early in life, like there's no fix to that,
right.
And this is something that we just have to live with for the rest of our lives. There might be some good that comes out of it, but it's not one of those like clean, happy endings. This is for the, everything was good, all nice and good at the end. And what I invited our congregation members to do is to share an example, to kind of get into groups of 2. So this might actually be more appropriate for small groups, to get into small groups of 2 or 3, and to share something in their own life that is kind of a long-standing source of pain as well, that there isn't any kind of ready fix for it. And then my assignment for the other two people in those small groups is just to say nothing.
Wow, that's hard.
And just bear witness to this other person's story and observe their heart in the process of them just bearing witness and not saying anything. And it is exactly what you talked about. It was one of the most difficult, excruciating experiences. As we debriefed it, everyone's like, Pastor Dave, why did you do that to us? That was really mean. It was so hard. And that was kind of an invitation for us to kind of observe our tendencies to want to bring resolution to things that defy resolution on this side of heaven.
Wow, that's a great awareness exercise. I love that. I think we're going to have to use that. So we're almost out of time. So I wanted to just ask you if you had any final thoughts for us that you'd like to share.
Yes. I think so. I think one of the last things I want to mention is that those of us in our church communities that struggle with mental illness, they are certainly individuals who are highly valued by God, created in the image of God, and they deserve care and accompaniment and our energy and time and resources in the church. And oftentimes we think of them as recipients of our energy.
Yeah.
And as kind of a parting idea, I also want to make the point that we have so much to learn from them as well. It goes both ways. And I have found that those who have a history of struggling with mental illness, those who are presently struggling with mental illness, that on one hand, they have a capacity to, just like any of us, to create much damage and destruction within our communities. And at the same time, they're actually often some of the most compassionate, gifted individuals that are uniquely attuned to the suffering of others and just are so gifted in knowing how to accompany and support other people because they have suffered themselves. It takes me back to 2 Corinthians 1:3-4, like it talks about how God is the God of all comfort, who comforts us, in our sufferings, so that we can comfort others with the sufferings we receive from Christ. And I found this to be true among people who have experienced mental illness, that they have received the comfort from God, and they know the process of recovery intimately, and oftentimes they are probably the best and most experienced guides for the rest of us to learn from on how to support and accompany people who are experiencing similar situations as well.
That's such a good word. I'm reminded of Johnny Erickson Tada spoke a while back. This really changed my thinking around special needs in particular, but mental illness as well, where she's exactly as you said, Dave, instead of focusing on what can we do for them and making them the other, the focus was on how can they bless your church. And she said, people with special needs, people with mental challenges, they are a blessing to the church, and they will change the heart of your church. And wherever you allow them to be, they will be a blessing to you. And I had never heard it that way ever. And this was like a decade ago. And it really changed my perspective. And then having a special needs ministry, seeing the blessing for our church, it really has impacted the heart of our church and grown us in love and patience and kindness and all the good stuff that in ways that we wouldn't if we stayed in neat messes. So I totally agree. I think that would be huge. And we would reflect the heart of Jesus so much better as well. But it's hard and it's messy. So So thank you so much for your input. We'll link to your your messages. I think that would be cool to listen to as well. And also, if people want to see more of what you've done or written or want to get in touch with you, I know you also have a very limited, because you're so busy, clinical practice, as well as some other resources on your website. It's drdavidcwang.com. And you can reach out. And I guess if there's any pastors out there who want to be equipped, you can come to your Viola University's School of Psychology, and then learn from you there as a professor. I'm really
yes.
Now I'm thinking maybe this is time for my third chapter. So thank you so much for your time and for the work you're doing. And it matters so much to the church and such a blessing. So God bless you and your ministry and your family.
Blessings to you too, Carolyn.
And thank you all for listening to Group Talk, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Here to There, part of the Group Talk network of podcasts. If you like what you've heard, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more, make sure you check out smallgroupnetwork.com for more resources.